Good evening. On behalf of the Ascension Parish Library, thank you for joining us for tonight's presentation on William Frantz Public School, a story of race, resistance, resiliency, and recovery in New Orleans. Tonight, we are joined by the three authors of this book, Connie Schaffer, Meg White, and Martha Viator. They will talk about their recent book, which is more than an examination of education in one school in one city. It actually recounts stories equally important that have unfolded within the walls and the neighborhood surrounding it. Also tonight, you will be given some opportunities to volunteer throughout the presentation. If you decide to participate, you will be able to raise your hands. And once you're recognized, you'll get to participate. And after that, you'll be able to lower your hand. Also, if you have any additional comments to make, please feel free to use your chat option, and we will address those probably at the end of the presentation. But at this time, I would like to go ahead and thank our special guests for taking the time out of their busy schedules to join us. And let's welcome our three authors. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Griselle. I'm Martha Graham Viator, and on behalf of my co-authors, thanks for the opportunity to talk tonight about our book, William Frantz, A Story of Race, Resistance, Resiliency, and Recovery in New Orleans. We are truly honored to share with all of you some of what we learned as we researched the stories for this book. Before we get started, I do want to remind everyone that we will ask for volunteers to read short excerpts from our book on the PowerPoint slides. And so if you would like to volunteer, please raise your hand and one of us will call on you. We will reserve about 10 minutes at the end for questions. And if we don't get to them, you can always email me. I will provide that email address at the end. My co-authors and I are going to introduce ourselves and explain what got us interested in this project. I'm Martha Graham Viator, and I lived in Lafayette, Louisiana. I attended public schools from grades 4 through 12, and I went to USL, what was called USL at that time, and majored in history. So therefore, I jumped at the chance to work on this project because I had lived through desegregation. I was in 5th grade when the Lafayette Parish public schools were ordered to desegregate in 1969. I returned to Lafayette after being gone for about 35 years, about 18 months ago. I taught high school history, and I also taught social studies methods at Rowan University, and my husband and I just retired. So we're happy to be back in Louisiana. Meg, tell us about yourself and your story.
So Martha and I, for a few years, worked together at Rowan University, and then I left Rowan and went to Stockton University, which is on the other side of the state of New Jersey. And we started to do some research about looking a little deeper into the Ruby Bridges story and the story of William Frantz Public School. And what we found was that there was a lot to tell and there was a lot to research, and we all had such an interest in it. And we just started. We started researching, we started writing, we started thinking this was going to be an article, and somehow it became a 6-chapter book. Connie?
Thanks, Meg. I'm Connie Schaffer. I am an associate professor at the University of Nebraska. And like Martha, my background was in social sciences and history education. And so this was, really an appealing project for me. I became first aware of William Frantz Public School when I was working on an earlier book that I authored with Meg White and another colleague. And we used one of the teachers from William Frantz Public School, Barbara Henry, we used her story as a case study. And so then I became familiar with the school, and then it just kept popping up in conversations, and I would mention it and people would say, well, did you know this? And did you know that? And so, like Meg said, it just is a project that has blossomed beyond that. So with that, I think we'll just get into the book a little bit, if that's okay with everybody. So what you're seeing here is a really high-level overview of the book and the 4 themes that run through the book and run through the stories. You also see a timeline of major events here. So we have race, resistance, resiliency, and recovery. And those correspond with the significant markers in time that you see on the line towards the bottom of the screen. The book actually begins with a little bit before the opening date of the school. The school opened in 1938. And then, you know, like many schools, it just continued sort of as an unassuming neighborhood school. And of course, the Brown decision in 1954 marks a significant transition for all of public education. So you see that transition from those, just in the color of the timeline, right? And so that moved us past the separate but equal practices in public schools and moved us towards desegregation. And that happened at William Frantz Public School and Orleans Parish schools in 1960. So 6 years after the Brown case. And another monumental shift for William Frantz, of course, came after Hurricane Katrina. And later in the presentation, we'll introduce you to the school currently housed in the William Frantz Public Building. At least it's been there since 2013. And of course, a great deal happened between the 5 dates that you see on the timeline. And that's really what we're going to try to do. We're going to try to connect these stories. They happened at William Frantz Public School and they happened across New Orleans. And so with that, we're just going to get into the book and some excerpts from the book. Before we start getting too far into the book, we are, of course, 3 white women who recognize our demographic impacts our perspective. And as we uncovered these stories, we saw how language and the use of terms changed over time and changed between people. And so for consistency and for impact, we made some decisions about the words we chose to use within the book. For example, a simple thing like choosing to capitalize the terms white and black. And we did that because so much of the social context around the history of the school was based on skin color. Another example of a choice we made is that we use the term desegregation rather than integration, even though that term was used interchangeably oftentimes in 1960. We chose to use desegregation because so many of the efforts, particularly in the early years, were focused on physically bringing Black children into schools with white children. But they did not afford Black students or their families or their history equal representation or influence within those schools. So unfortunately, we continue to work on integration as a country within our schools and with other systems. So you'll hear us use the word desegregation versus integration. And those are just a couple of examples. But given that overview and context, let's get into the first part of the book. Like previously noted, William Frantz Public School had been open for about 16 years before the Brown ruling, and just over 20 years before Ruby Bridges was allowed to enroll in the school in 1960. And the next slide includes 2 excerpts from the book that show the buildup to November of 1960. And Meg, I'm going to ask if you would read those excerpts.
Do I have to raise my hand? Thurgood Marshall, like William Aubert and Leontine Goins-Luke and many others in New Orleans' 9th Ward, knew the existing school segregation systems resulted in educational discrepancies, too numerous too substantial, and too consequential to be ignored. Leander Perez embodied the position of Southern segregationist and combined this with substantial legislative acumen and relentless disdain for the federal government. The White Citizens Council declared desegregation in New Orleans would equate to, quote, dropping an atomic bomb on every school in Louisiana, end quote, and told the crowd to prepare for war.
Thank you, Meg. That first excerpt alludes to efforts in New Orleans that happened really simultaneously to the Brown case. The NAACP and the Black community organizers from the 9th Ward had filed a suit, Bush v. New Orleans, that was very similar to the Topeka case. Ultimately, they retracted that case to allow the Brown case to be the central focus for the NAACP and for ending the separate but equal public school policies via the federal court system. Once that Brown ruling was announced in 1954, the reaction in Louisiana and in many other locations was intense. And many actions were taken to prevent or at least impede school desegregation. And eventually, a number of federal court rulings finally made it clear that the Orleans Parish School Board was going to need to begin its school desegregation plan in the 1960 school year. As summer waned on in 1960, city officials were desperate to avoid the situation that had unfolded in Little Rock, and they wanted to avoid sort of the economic repercussions of the negative publicity. Others, like influential leaders, Leander Perez and others, and the White Citizens Council, whipped up a fury and decried the dangers of desegregating schools. As you can see from the comment that was made at a segregationist rally that Meg just quoted. Eventually, the debate became focused on, does New Orleans want to close its schools to avoid desegregation or to protest what they saw as federal overreach? Or did New Orleans want to open them but limit desegregation? And the Orleans Public School Board chose the latter and began to prepare its plan, but in the meantime, successfully delayed that plan until November. They used the court system to postpone that from happening when school opened right away in the fall. But finally, on November 14, Ruby Bridges was allowed to enroll in William Frantz Public School, as were 3 first grade students, all girls, who enrolled in McDonough 19. And as you can see by the headline from the Times-Picayune there, many saw this as a regrettable concession. And certainly most of the community, or many members of the community, did not embrace desegregation. And most people are really familiar with this image and images of the protesters outside of William Frantz Public School. The situation was volatile. The racist sentiments turned into overt violence and threats of violence. And this, of course, precipitated the use of federal marshals to accompany Bridges to and from school and to offer protection really throughout the school year. The next excerpt is going to highlight the attention in the national media that became focused on William Frantz Public School. There was much less attention to the other 3 girls who attended McDonough 19, because at that school, there was a complete boycott by the white students. Whereas at William Frantz Public School, a small number of white students continued to attend the school, but the school principal and teachers kept them completely separated from Bridges in terms of classroom, lunchroom, interactions at recess. But that is why the attention really turned to William Frantz Public School and to Bridges, maybe more so than McDonough 19. Chriselle, do you want to read the excerpts that are on the screen now?
Sure. Bridges entered Frantz Public School, and the school entered the living rooms and collective psyche of millions of Americans. Heinous racism, the ism that had incessantly preyed upon the city and citizens of New Orleans now focus its steely attention on the fortress of democracy, public education, and specifically Frantz Public School. It did so with such intensity, it surprised both its victims and its perpetrators, as well as those who for decades chose quiet complacency and self-declared neutrality over justice and equality.
Thank you. So now the eyes of the world are turned towards William Frantz Public School. And as that happened, it became an iconic part of the civil rights movement. And the images and references to bridges and the schools started to appear in multiple places. Both John Updike and John Steinbeck, Pulitzer Prize winning authors, wrote about the school in 1960 and 1961. And 4 years later, Norman Rockwell's painting, which you see here, The Problem We All Live With, appeared in Look magazine. And that further cemented the role of the school in the collective memory of Americans. And in future decades, there would be several children's books written about this and a made-for-TV Disney movie. So it just continued to build the legacy around William Frantz Public School and all that happened there.
Can I add something to that?
Excuse me?
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
In our research, we found out that Ruby Bridges did not know that this painting existed for 18 years. It wasn't until she was being interviewed by a reporter that he brought her attention to the fact that this had been painted. I just think that's fascinating. 18 years, she didn't know. I mean, she was only 6 years old at the time, but it was that many years after that she learned about the painting.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Meg. Thanks for sharing that. And, you know, the painting has quite a history of its own. President Obama chose to hang it in the White House, and it has surfaced in other sort of iconic moments in America's history as well. So Martha, I'm going to turn things over to you now. You know, we've set the stage about school desegregation and the racism around that, and you're going to talk a little bit about resistance.
Yes, thank you so much, Connie. So we already seen some examples of overt resistance to desegregation, such as that image that we just saw of Rockwell's painting. Now let's look at some other examples. Could I get a volunteer? Maybe Meg, would you mind reading these two excerpts?
Sure. No longer able to avoid sending their children to desegregated public and parochial schools in Orleans Parish, many white families separated themselves from Black families by moving. Superintendent Dulce initiated the district's initial and perfunctory efforts to desegregate the faculty in 1966. More than 5 years since student desegregation began, many white teachers still opposed it, especially within the high schools.
So these are just two examples of a variety of resistance we uncovered in this story. Some families who could afford to move to neighboring parishes did so over the years following 1960, although this was gradual because they didn't desegregate all the schools, all the grades, all at once. It would be about 7 years before the high schools were desegregated in Orleans Parish. The result of this resistance in the form of white flight left a population that was increasingly Black, and as a result of a changing economy that was becoming less industrial, this remaining population found it hard to find jobs and therefore poor. The other excerpt here shows the resistance within the system of education in New Orleans. In our research, we found a survey commissioned by the school board in the Orleans Parish School archives. This survey revealed that white teachers did not feel comfortable with faculty integration and overwhelmingly believed that their Black colleagues were not qualified to teach white students. Clearly, desegregation was not going to be easy to achieve. If we could see this chart here, this shows a snapshot of the district's student enrollment by race. We didn't include all of the years because it would be too small to see on the screen, but it really highlights the resistance in the form of white flight after 1970. After peaking in the 1970s, enrollment of Black students was fairly steady from 1975 all the way to 2000. If you look at the blue portion of all the bar graphs, it's probably around 75,000. Most of the decline was the continued result of fewer white students attending public schools. But you can see in the few years before Katrina, the number of Black students began to decline. In the post-Katrina numbers, we included other students to show the increasing number of Hispanic and Asian students. If we could look at the next slide. Would anybody care to read?
I can read that one.
Okay, Connie.
In 1985, the Times-Picayune published Cheating Our Children, a 15-day series on education. The powerful Sunday front page launch of the series failed to address how problems external to schools might be impacting education. While many New Orleans teachers described the struggles their students faced outside school, later articles also quoted Orleans Parish administrators who attributed the school's challenges to the lack of support, welfare dependency, and a, quote, something for nothing mentality, unquote, of parents.
Thank you, Connie. This excerpt indicates resistance by institutions and authorities to acknowledge students' perspectives and needs. Administrators were often, it seemed, too quick to blame the lack of some students' success on factors that they believed they couldn't or shouldn't address. And this newspaper series only reinforced the public's attitude that really all the problems in the schools boiled down to the parents and the students. However, not everyone on the school board was willing to accept this. Just a few years later, in 1988, the district conducted one of the first studies in the country of the Black male achievement gap. An appointed task force found the district relied heavily on the discretion of teachers to deal with relatively minor classroom misbehaviors. And on this next slide, we see teachers that were either unable or unwilling to resolve conflict with their Black students, because the graph shows that the number of Black males in the total enrollment was less than 50% in that first bar. But yet the percentage of Black males who were suspended and especially expelled was way above 50%. So we can see the suspensions on the fourth bar and expulsions. I mean, Black males were above nearly 80% of all expulsions in the district. So that just really shows that bias. Members of the task force interviewed students and surveyed teachers. And as in this excerpt, the survey responses from teachers seem to substantiate the students' claim that teachers held low academic expectations for Black students, as 60% of the students did not believe their Black students would go to college, 60% of the teachers, even though the students themselves had clearly planned to go to college. So let's look at the next slide. Thank you, Connie. Meg, would you like to read this one?
Sure. Inside the building, dedicated Frantz Public School teachers worked to support the academic and social needs of their students. They offered special programs such as the regularly occurring Black History Soul Bowl and partnered with community organizations to sponsor a Say Yes science program. On Saturday mornings, a group of teachers met with girls from the school as part of the school's drug-free campaign.
So we had just seen the resistance, and this excerpt shows us the resiliency of of students and parents and teachers who were committed to desegregation and equity. Um, in the 1990s, we saw that declining enrollment and the inability to provide for the increasing needs of the students. But in the face of all of this, these are the kinds of things that were going on. And this is just in the Frantz Public School, but it was going on throughout the entire district. Can we see the next slide? Thank you. We also have, at this time in the 1990s, Ruby Bridges began caring for her nieces after the death of her brother. And it just so happened that her nieces were going to the William Frantz School. So the daily walk that she took them was the exact same walk that she herself had 30 years earlier. And as she's doing this, it prompted her to volunteer as a liaison between parents and the school. The work of Ruby Bridges to provide support to families is another example of the incredible resiliency of this neighborhood. Even though with these efforts at William Frantz and other schools throughout the city, the district faced a variety of financial scandals in the 2 decades before Katrina. Crizel, would you like to read that excerpt?
Sure. The level of corruption shocked the residents of New Orleans and left a seasoned FBI agent in disbelief. Quote, some of the things that have been presented to me, and I've been in this business 30 years, I just can't believe are occurring. What we're seeing is people who have children in these same schools stealing from them and depriving children, end quote.
Thank you, Crizel. The front page here reveals a payroll scandal in 2003. But as the FBI agent says, there were many more, such as insurance fraud, superintendents and other high-ranking officials, using school employees to work on their private homes, other administrators using inflated attendance rates to improve school performance scores, and the dereliction of duty by the transportation department. These are just some of the ways that the district failed and stole from its students. So in the midst of this corruption, can it be a surprise that the city's students did not perform well on these standardized tests? This report card for William Frantz in the spring of 2005, just before Katrina, we can see evidence of that impact. Imagine how disheartening it must have been for parents and teachers to see their neighborhood school labeled as academically unacceptable. But at that very moment, in the spring of 2005, Frantz Public School found itself on 2 very significant lists, juxtaposing the current academic underperformance within the building and the historic legacy represented in its renowned outer facade. The district placed Frantz on the list of schools to be closed, while the National Register of Historic Places simultaneously listed the building as a protected site. Bolstered and protected by its history, Frantz refused to capitulate to the ravages of neglect, poverty, deteriorating neighborhoods, accountability measures, academic labels, incompetence, corruption, mismanagement, and in the next months, Mother Nature. Just months later, in 2005, Hurricane Katrina ravaged the Gulf Coast. And this slide shows us what happened to inside the building of William Frantz. You can see that the storm damages, in addition to years of neglect and deferring maintenance, was going to result in just incredible repair costs. Estimates placed it at $5.5 million. But despite the damage, the building continued to stand as a prominent feature in the neighborhood, the only two-story building surrounded by single-story homes. This too illustrates the resiliency of this incredible building. We will take a quick look at the recovery after the storm, but let's first set the stage. Meg, would you like
Sure.
to read?
Both the Orleans Parish School Board and Recovery School District seemed to forget about Frantz Public School, but that did not matter as there was little need for expediency to repair Frantz and ready it for its classes. Few students remained in the neighborhoods surrounding the school, and all of the school's teachers had been fired. Charter school advocates, insensitive to, or at the least oblivious to the role of neighborhood schools like Frantz, pushed to rapidly advance the opportunity to reframe public education. Once the waters receded, the school remained fenced off from the street. There it waited, silent and alone. Surely help would come.
Thank you, Meg. Ultimately, the building did recover, but it would take almost a decade. Achille Academy, which is a charter school, would eventually open in the building. But like many other charter schools in New Orleans, Achille had struggled to find a permanent home in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. When it opened, nearly all of Achille Academy's teachers were from Teach for America or Teach New Orleans or Teach NOLA, and most grew up outside of New Orleans and didn't know the city or the people. In the summer of 2013, Achille Academy moved into the renovated William Frantz building and held a ribbon cutting ceremony on the steps leading to the original entrance, the door with the William Frantz Public School inscribed above it. However, today that grand entrance has been relegated to a side entrance. The main entrance is in the new addition, and as you can see in the picture on the right, a plastic banner identifying the name of the charter school hangs below the permanent letters marking the school's historic legacy through its name, William Frantz School. So I'm handing it back to Connie, who's going to provide some concluding remarks before we take questions.
So you can see over the course of the history of this school, the many stories that we uncovered, not just about the school, but about Orleans Parish schools in general. And we just passed the 60th anniversary of the desegregation of William Frantz Public School, and the story still garners national and international attention. We wrote kind of a short synopsis of the book for a publication called The Conversation. That piece was published on November 14th, 2020, so 60 years later. That piece was picked up by Yahoo News, the Associated Press, and other outlets, and it had over 18,000 readers over the course of the next few weeks, and was also republished in the Washington Post. So you can see 60 years later, this school still holds a place in America's memory, psyche, and perspective of public education. And we would argue that that's a perspective that goes way beyond the school, way beyond New Orleans, but across the country in terms of public schools. And I guess with that, we would entertain questions or pose a question for you. What does this story mean to you? And from your perspective as being either from Louisiana or maybe having some kind of connection to education, we're always curious to know how other people perceive the story.
Okay, I've opened up the chat box. Feel free to go ahead and share with the chat if you have any questions for our speakers.
And of course, you can always contact us if you have questions or want to know more. Obviously, we picked very few excerpts out of the book and tried to just highlight those 4 themes in a small way, but there's just so many really very interesting details that we hope you'll have a chance to read in the book.
We do look like we do have one question here. Can you see it, Connie?
Let me get there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here for just a moment.
I can read it to you if you need me to.
It says, I taught at Lusher School
Ooh.
in around 2000. So
Wow.
that's from Suzanne Harris. So I'd be curious, there's a few references to Lusher School in the book, both before and after Katrina. So I'd be curious about your experiences there. It says they were excited about their history. Mm-hmm.
Oh, cool.
Okay, and one other
Lusher was
question
one
that was
of-
in the question and answer, and I'll read it for you, is from Ms. Pam Tesserot. Is there any mention of the white people in NOLA who attended school during these violent times?
Yeah, we do have quite a bit in chapter 2 about the white families whose children remained at William Frantz Public School. There was a local historian who did some interviewing of those families, and they were also featured often in the news, whether that was the Times-Picayune or the local TV stations. They spent much more time interviewing the white families than they did the Bridges family. Was that a conscious choice? I don't know. The Bridges family also, from what we understood, tried to take a step back and be out of that attention, but there was quite a bit about that, and we did write about them in chapter 2. Many of them were shocked by the attention that this was getting. Many of them chose to leave their children enrolled in William Frantz Public School because they didn't have other options. And some of them, I think, were trying to make a statement. It became very difficult for them. And most of them, many of the high profile families chose to take their kids out of the school eventually.
Connie, that question,
Yes.
another comment in here, it says from Pam Testroit, my father, Reverend Lloyd Foreman, walked me to William Frantz to attend kindergarten. So there's a lot in our book about you and your dad, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're honored to have you.
Absolutely.
They kept Ruby and I separated all year. We had to move out of our home due to the violence. Yeah. We read a lot about your family, and we wrote about you in our, and I hope you'll have a chance to read our book, because we hope we'll get to read it.
You know, your father and you walked that gauntlet many days and listened to horrible things and witnessed horrible things as you walked into that building. And, you know, other families and your family too experienced violence and threats in your homes, in your parents' places of business. It was an extraordinary time. We also wrote a little bit about the group of people, the Save Our School group that initially started what they called the shuttles to and from your homes to the school, but eventually it became too violent for them to feel comfortable doing that, and they chose to stop.
Okay, I do not see any more questions. I would like to thank our guest presenters, Ms. Martha, Ms. Meg, as well as Connie. Thank you for joining us tonight and sharing this wonderful book. I hope everyone gets a chance to read the book. I know we should be having it on our shelves very soon, so our patrons will have that opportunity, but I guess you can get it on Amazon if not. So do read the book and learn much more about this fascinating history. Again, thank you all three for sharing this story.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you so much.
Mhm. And thank everybody for joining. Have a great night.